On the final day for confirming enrollment, I finally arrived at the admissions office of United University. Professor, I am Emily Carter, a newly admitted student in the School of Aerodynamics. I have not given up on my enrollment. Tears and sweat blurred together. No one knew it had taken me 2 lifetimes to reach this moment. The admissions officer looked at me in shock. Didn't your fiancé come by earlier? He showed us a marriage certificate with your signature and an agreement stating that you voluntarily gave up your admission. He said you had decided not to continue your studies and were preparing to get married instead. When Daniel Morgan placed the marriage certificate before me for my signature, I was overjoyed. After all, at 16, my parents had decided my fate and sent me to his house to be his personal maid. Even though he never truly wanted me, he still treated me well in every way. He guided me in reading and writing, and when he discovered my talent for accounting, he entrusted me with managing the Morgan family's business. Even when we were forced to flee south and enemy planes bombed us into the river, when we were on the brink of death, he never let go of my hand. In times of turmoil, when life was unpredictable, if we could not know when death would come, I only wished that our names could be written together. Daniel even wrote those exact words in our marriage certificate. I signed my name joyfully, believing that my devotion had finally moved him. I never realized that among the papers was one stating that I voluntarily gave up my enrollment. Professor, I have thought it through. I still want to be a student at United University, not just Mrs. Morgan, a woman without even her own name. In my past life, I blindly walked into my role as Mrs. Morgan. My name disappeared, replaced by his. To the outside world, he always referred to me formally as Mrs. Morgan. Over time, I forgot my own name. Each time we moved, I introduced myself as Mrs. Morgan, and even convinced myself to accept it. After all, wasn't it for my sake that he kept moving, to avoid encountering his first love, Joanna Thompson? This was proof that he loved me, wasn't it? I naively believed that when he chose me over Joanna, it was because he loved me. But sometimes doubts crept in. Every time we moved, he would spend an entire night sitting in silence, writing farewell letters to Joanna. Every day, when he dusted his desk, he would pause over the photo tucked beneath the glass, a picture of Joanna framed in a bronze mirror. Years passed, and everything changed, except for his love for her. Each time I saw that photo, a dull ache spread through my chest. If he could never forget Joanna, then why did he marry me? But when I voiced my pain, he simply turned off the bedside lamp and said, "Let's have a child. Maybe a child will change things." Soon I had a son. When he was small, he needed me. When he learned to read, he resented my lack of higher education. At school events, he always sought out Daniel instead. It wasn't until I fell ill and was hospitalized that my son finally came to see me, and he didn't come alone. He brought his university professor, Joanna Thompson. "You and Dad have no feelings for each other anyway," my son said. "Why not let him be with Professor Thompson?" Father and son, perfectly in sync. Joanna didn't even bother pretending. She laid everything out plainly. "Back then, I was ranked just below you in the United University entrance exam. Daniel married you only to give me your spot." Her voice trembled with suppressed grievance. "If I could do it all over again, I would rather have given up my admission than lost Daniel." A thunderous silence filled my mind. Every question I had ever asked myself, finally, I had my answer. Daniel had married me only so Joanna could take my place at United University. The man I had spent 40 years with had never once loved me. "I've already sacrificed 40 years to make up for your loss," Daniel said coldly. "Even after your death, can't I finally live for myself?" My son, whom I had raised with my own hands, looked at me and said, "You only lost a university admission, but Professor Thompson lost the love of her life. They all believed I had been the lucky one. But what about my life? Who would give me back my 40 years? I died full of resentment. But when I opened my eyes again, I was 18 once more. I had not yet married Daniel Morgan. The enrollment deadline was a month away. "Emily, don't forget this time." "I won't." I clutched my hard-earned admission letter to my chest. 1 month. That was enough time to pack my bags and leave the Morgan estate for good. But before I even had a chance to pack, my belongings had already been thrown out of my room, carelessly piled in the hallway downstairs. People passing by trampled over my faded clothes as if they were worthless rags. Joanna Thompson stood there with an air of entitlement. How could such trash ever deserve to stay in such a nice room? Daniel Morgan attempted to stop her. There are plenty of rooms in the house. Why must you insist on taking hers? The word taking seemed to strike a nerve in Joanna. Her voice trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. Am I the one taking? Or is it him who is taking you away from me? In a month you'll be married to her. There will be no place left for me in this house. Daniel, can't I even stay close to you for just a little while longer? In my past life, she had been just like this, never mentioning the fact that she had stolen my university admission spot. Instead, she turned it around, making it seem as though I was the one who had stolen Daniel from her. The truth was, Daniel had married me out of guilt, and I had been kept in the dark the entire time. No one had ever asked if I was willing to make such a trade. Yet, they acted like they were the star-crossed lovers I had cruelly separated. Now, I simply watched this ridiculous scene unfold with cold indifference. My lips curled into a mocking smile as I turned to Daniel. What do you think, Mr. Morgan? Should I clear out my room so Miss Thompson can move in? Daniel clearly hadn't expected me, the one who had always been so patient and accommodating, to throw the question back at him. Joanna, realizing that Daniel was getting annoyed, quickly reined in her temper. Forget it. Forget it. I won't move. Why don't we just go to the Southgate Theater and watch a show together? And just like that, the matter was dropped. But most of her belongings had already been moved into my room. Everyone simply assumed I would take the loss quietly and move somewhere else. I gathered the books and notes I needed for school, as well as the few pieces of clothing that hadn't been trampled beyond use. My savings were running low, and there would be many expenses once school started. I needed to be frugal where I could. Daniel seemed satisfied with my silent retreat. Don't worry, he assured me. She's only staying for a month. Once her school starts, she'll move out, and it won't interfere with our wedding. I didn't tell him that I had already confirmed my enrollment at United University. This time, Joanna, who had ranked below me, wouldn't be the one taking my place. But I wasn't sure how far Daniel would go for her, so it was best not to reveal anything just yet. Miss Thompson is fond of you, I said calmly. Seeing us get married will make her sad. Why don't we wait until after she leaves for school to discuss our wedding plans? Daniel hadn't expected me to be so understanding of Joanna's feelings. His expression softened. I know this is unfair to you. Joanna was spoiled growing up, but she doesn't mean to target you. Her family is gone now, and once I see her off to school, I can rest easy. I'll take you away from here so she won't bother you anymore. In my past life, I had been moved by these words. He was willing to explain himself, willing to reassure me that his care for Joanna was only out of obligation. He saw my struggles and promised to cut ties with Joanna for my sake. What more could I ask for? But I had never stopped to question, why was it always me who had to be the one to step aside? Why was it always me who had to compromise? 7 days before the start of school, I began discreetly moving my belongings into the dorms at United University. I never expected to run into Daniel on my way there. When he saw the luggage in my hands, his brows furrowed. The wedding is just around the corner. Where are you going? I remained calm and lied without hesitation. I ran into some friends from my hometown. They're struggling, so I'm giving them some extra clothes and bedding I no longer need. Daniel had always been prideful, and the people from my hometown were poor and unrefined in his eyes. I was sure he wouldn't want to get involved and would drop the matter. But today, surprisingly, he offered, I'll drive you. Daniel had purchased a car, but I had rarely ridden in it. He had assumed I seldom went out, while Joanna, who enjoyed socializing, was often taken out to the Southgate Theater, to dance halls, and to fancy dinners. Even now, as I opened the car door, I spotted a tube of lipstick, Miss Fortuna, left behind by Joanna. Without a word, Daniel picked it up and tucked it away. Since you've come to West City, you've hardly gone out. Let me take you for a drive. I shook my head. There's no need. Just drop me off at Wendland Street. He still took the long way around. The car stopped in front of a confectionery shop. Daniel got out and bought me a box of traditional pastries. For a moment, I felt as if I had returned to the year I was 16. Back then, he had only accepted my presence in his life because of his parents' arrangements. One day, my stomach had growled with hunger, and he had pulled a piece of imported chocolate from his pocket. I took a bite and immediately frowned. "It's so bitter," I had complained. He had chuckled. "Foreigners like this kind of thing." "Then what do you like?" "I like the pastries from Joru Bakery," I had told him. The next morning, the entire Shen estate knew that young Master Daniel had driven all the way to Joru Bakery at dawn and bought out their entire stock of pastries in my name, handing them out to everyone. Now he handed me a piece. "Try it. Does it taste like Joru Bakery's pastries?" The sugar coating melted on my tongue, but my tears fell uncontrollably. It was bitter, 40 years of heartache, disappointment, and regret. I could no longer taste a hint of sweetness. "Bookmark, go back." Daniel lowered his head, reaching out as if to wipe my tears away, but before his hand could touch my face, Joanna's voice rang out from a distance. "Daniel." His hand froze in midair. I turned away and wiped my tears with the back of my hand. Joanna didn't seem to notice what had just happened between us. She was frowning, annoyed, holding up a broken high heel. I got my shoe stuck in the cobblestone street and snapped the heel. "I don't even know how I'll get back now," she complained. She slipped into the car naturally, as if it belonged to her. But Daniel didn't move. His usual confident smile faltered for the first time. "Aren't we going?" she asked, feigning innocence. "My foot really hurts, Daniel." Silently, I reached into the back seat and grabbed my belongings, ready to get out. But Daniel suddenly stopped me, his grip firm. He turned to Joanna and said, "I was here first. I need to take her to Wenland Street first." Joanna lowered her gaze, letting out a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "Oh, Daniel, are you really worried you won't have another chance to drive her somewhere? But after this, I'll be all alone." That single sentence was enough to make Daniel hesitate. When he saw the swelling on her ankle, his resolve wavered even more. "I'm sorry," he said. I shook my head. "Miss Thompson's injury is more urgent. Go ahead." The luggage on my shoulder was heavy, but compared to the weight of decades of a loveless marriage, what was this? Finally, the last day arrived. I had moved all my belongings out of the Morgan estate. The only thing left behind was a stack of handwritten notes, Daniel's meticulous study materials for me. Back when I applied to United University, it was Daniel who had encouraged me. As the daughter of an accountant, I had never attended a proper girls' school, nor had I received a formal education. I simply had a talent for numbers, and had learned to read by following along with Daniel's studies. But under the dim glow of the study lamp, he had once looked at me with eyes full of encouragement, as bright as stars. "How will you ever know if you can do it if you don't even try?" But when I actually passed the entrance exam, he wanted me to give it all up, to step aside for his first love. Now, as I was about to begin a new life, I had no intention of taking these old notes with me. Joanna, however, took my actions as a deliberate show of arrogance. Her gaze was full of hatred. "You just got lucky. But because of you, I lost Daniel forever." She blocked my way, her expression growing increasingly unhinged. "What makes you worthy of marrying him? What do you have that I don't?" Her eyes glinted with madness. "Why don't you just die? If you were gone, Daniel wouldn't have to force himself to marry a woman he doesn't love." With that, she suddenly shoved me backward. I barely managed to grab onto the railing, stopping myself from falling. Instead, she lost her balance from the force of her own push, hitting the railing and scraping her forehead. Daniel arrived just in time to see the scene unfold. His first instinct was to rush over and cradle Joanna in his arms. His voice was sharp with accusation. "I already agreed to marry you. What are you trying to do now?" Pain shot up my arm. My face turned pale. It was probably dislocated. Joanna, with tears glistening in her eyes, immediately twisted the story. She said she's the future Mrs. Morgan, the mistress of this estate, and that I should get out. She even said she'd never let you see me again. Tomorrow was my first day at university. I had no energy left to argue with her. I endured the pain and turned to leave, hoping to find a doctor in town. But Daniel blocked my path. Apologized to Joanna. I looked up at him, seeing only disappointment in his eyes. "You know she's struggling to accept our marriage. Why do you have to push her like this?" "You deliberately showed off in front of her. If you don't apologize today, I will reconsider our marriage. Do you think this marriage is some kind of gift to me? I let out a cold laugh. I have to humble myself, coax his first love into happiness, and then he'll graciously grant me the chance to marry him? And if I refuse, he has every right to take it back? I looked straight into his eyes. Mr. Morgan, you are far too arrogant. Have you ever once considered asking me what I want? Whether I was willing to trade my future for this marriage? Whether I was willing to accept a husband whose heart has always belonged to someone else? Whether I wanted to live a life of silent sacrifice? Yes, I once loved you, I admitted. But just because I loved you, does that mean I deserve this kind of humiliation? Daniel's face flushed red, then turned pale. Without another word, he locked the door. Since you refuse to apologize, then stay home and reflect on your actions. Once you're ready to apologize, I'll let you out. No matter how hard I pounded on the door, no one responded. As dawn approached, I had no other choice. Ignoring the pain in my arm, I forced my dislocated joint back into place, bit down on the agony, and tore my bedsheets into strips. Tying them to the window, I climbed down from the 4th floor. Today was my first day at United University. I couldn't afford to miss it again. I would not let Daniel Morgan destroy my future a second time. I suppressed the fear in my heart and carefully climbed down. But when I reached the 2nd floor, the fabric tore. I fell. Fortunately, the ground below was soft earth, freshly tilled by the gardener. I rolled to the side, shaken but largely unharmed. I took one last look at the Morgan estate, the place where I had wasted an entire lifetime. Goodbye, Emily Morgan. From now on, I was just Emily Carter. I successfully registered for school and officially became a freshman in the School of Aerodynamics at United University. Daniel came looking for me several times, but the campus security turned him away each time. Left with no other option, he sent letters through others. At first, his tone was harsh, demanding an explanation. Why did you leave without a word? Why didn't you take your luggage? Had you planned to abandon us all along? Were you just toying with us? After a few weeks, when I still hadn't responded, his letters softened. He said he truly wanted to marry me. Now that I was enrolled, Joanna had decided to retake the entrance exam next year. The Morgan estate had plenty of rooms. Why not return and live there instead of staying in a crowded dormitory? I ignored every letter. I used them as scratch paper for my calculations. The coursework at United University was intense, especially in the School of Aerodynamics. Only a few dozen students had been admitted, and the selection process had been rigorous. Some couldn't handle the pressure and dropped out within the first few weeks. Every subject demanded precision, experimental mechanics, drafting, design, and testing. Reports had to be submitted on time, or points would be deducted. When using a slide rule, decimal points weren't marked, meaning every calculation had to be double-checked. A misplaced decimal could reduce a score to 1/10 of its value. 2 mistakes, and it became 100th. The department head expanded the curriculum, incorporating courses in mechanics and manufacturing. We were even required to intern at the West Side Aircraft Repair Factory. Standing on the vast, barren airfield under construction, my state of mind had completely shifted. I no longer cared for the suffocating confines of the Morgan estate. I no longer let Daniel Morgan's hot and cold affections affect me. No one here called me Mrs. Morgan. No one saw me as just a wife. I was Emily Carter. I was Miss Carter. I was Engineer Carter of United University. Then suddenly, the wind howled as an aircraft made an emergency landing. The clear blue sky was torn by the roar of an engine as the plane skidded several hundred meters before coming to a halt. The cockpit opened, the noise dissipated, and through the rising steam, I saw the edge of a military green flight jacket, its corners singed. A young pilot in his early 20s leaped down from the aircraft. His eyes were filled with laughter, brimming with warmth. "You're a student at United University?" I glanced at the embroidery on his jacket. Lucas Foster. We had actually met long ago. Back when Daniel and I had fled by ship, enemy planes had swooped low, strafing the deck with gunfire. Terrified passengers hid in the cabin, clutching their prayer beads, begging for divine protection. But on the deck there had been a little girl, alone. His mother had been struck by a grenade moments before and died on the spot. A second round of gunfire was about to rain down on us. Ignoring Daniel's desperate attempts to stop me, I rushed forward and pulled the child into my arms. At that moment, I could hear the deafening roar of enemy planes overhead. Just as I thought my life would end there, a fighter plane launched a surprise attack from behind the enemy aircraft, forcing their gunfire off course. Though the ship was still hit and water began flooding in, we managed to abandon it. Fortunately, we had already passed the most turbulent waters, and Daniel managed to bring both me and the little girl safely ashore. That was the moment I first thought of marrying Daniel. Looking back now, I realize it was nothing more than the suspension bridge effect, a fleeting attachment born from surviving a life-threatening experience. What truly stood out from that day was the number on the fighter plane that had saved us. I remembered it clearly now, as I stood in front of the very same aircraft, fuel nearly depleted, its body riddled with bullet holes. 617. And now, the responsibility of repairing it had fallen into my hands. His fellow pilots tried to persuade him. You should report this to the captain and request a more experienced engineer. After all, we're betting our lives on these planes. Can a mere college student really handle it? I had heard this kind of skepticism countless times. This was actually one of the more polite versions. In my past life, I had never attended college. Even my own son never trusted me. Mom, stop messing around. You never even went to university. How could you possibly know how to fix a radio? And even after I had repaired it, both he and Daniel assumed I had secretly paid someone to do it and then claimed the credit for myself. I get that you care about appearances, but don't lie in front of the child. Over the years, it seemed Daniel had completely forgotten that I had once demonstrated an aptitude for mathematics, that I had earned my place at United University through my own efforts. And yet, this man, Lucas Foster, someone I had barely spoken to before, was the one who stepped forward. Miss Carter is one of the top students in United University's School of Aerodynamics, he said calmly. Like us, she worked her way to the top of her field through skill and dedication. With that, he casually tossed a bottle of soda to the man who had spoken earlier. You're one to talk. Your first flight nearly crashed into someone's rooftop, remember? And did the captain replace you? I couldn't help but laugh. The other pilots noticed me standing at the door and suddenly became self-conscious, nudging each other awkwardly. Only Lucas remained unfazed. He pulled out a handkerchief, wiped down the nearest chair, and gestured toward it. Miss Carter, have a seat. He was giving me respect. Just as I was about to sit down, a familiar mocking voice cut through the air. An engineer? Who knows if she'll even finish her degree? Joanna Thompson had arrived. She had failed the United University entrance exam multiple times. It was only through Daniel's connections that she had finally gotten into another school. She had always been bitter about it, convinced that my acceptance had been nothing more than luck. I heard the coursework at the School of Aerodynamics is impossibly difficult, she sneered. Plenty of students drop out. Even if you did get in by sheer luck back then, you probably couldn't keep up. Now, I bet you're just hanging around these pilots to make a living. The other pilots immediately stood up, ready to defend me. I tugged at Lucas's sleeve, unwilling to waste my breath on Joanna. Let's go. I have work to do at the repair shop. But just as we reached the door, Daniel appeared and blocked my path. Grabbing my wrist, he demanded, Haven't you caused enough trouble? Come home with me. Even before Joanna had barged in, Daniel had already seen me. After just 3 years apart, he had barely recognized me. He had expected to find the same timid girl who used to follow him around like a shadow. Instead, I had been sitting among a group of pilots, smiling and laughing, completely at ease. At first, he hadn't believed Joanna's claim that I had been expelled from United University. But now, doubt flickered in his eyes. If they hadn't influenced you, then why did you leave the Morgan estate so suddenly? Why did you refuse to send me a single letter in all these years? I looked at him with cold indifference. And what letter should I have sent you? One begging for your permission to leave after you illegally locked me up? One apologizing for a crime I never committed? Should I have written to you to ask whether I was allowed to keep my rightful place at university? Or maybe to remind myself not to be foolish, because the only person you ever truly cared about was Joanna? My father forced me to take care of you out of gratitude for the Morgans' past kindness, I continued. But after years of war, after a lifetime spent as your wife in my past life, I think I've repaid that debt in full. Lucas, sensing my frustration, stepped forward and shielded me behind him. His tone was firm. She doesn't want to go with you, Mr. Morgan, didn't you hear her? The other pilots moved to stand beside him. The pilots stood protectively in front of me, shielding me completely. Miss Carter is one of our engineers at the West Side Repair Factory, one of them stated firmly. Mr. Morgan, if you wish to visit, kindly send a telegraph in advance. To prevent Daniel from harassing me any further, the 14th Air Squadron had Lucas personally escort me all the way back to my dormitory. On the way, I told him about my past with Daniel. It's a strange coincidence, I admitted. Back then, when we were fleeing by ship, it was you who shot down the enemy plane that allowed us to escape. I never got the chance to thank you. Lucas lowered his gaze slightly, as if lost in thought. Sensing his silence, I offered a way out. You must have saved so many people, you probably don't remember. But he lifted his head abruptly, his voice resolute. Of course, I remember. His deep eyes met mine. You were the girl standing at the bow of the ship. A light breeze tousled the strands of hair by my ear, and for a moment, the roaring of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. Not everyone would risk their life for a complete stranger. You were brave, he added. It was the same event, yet the reactions had been completely different. Back then, Daniel had scolded me for meddling, for risking my life for a stranger and nearly getting him killed in the process. I had carried that guilt for years, but the truth was, the ship had already been taking on water, the enemy had already spotted us. Whether or not I had run out to save the child would never have changed the outcome. It had taken me so many years to understand something so simple. The repairs on 617 went smoothly. I sent word to Lucas, letting him know the plane was ready for a test flight. Hearing footsteps approach, I slid out from beneath the aircraft, habitually raising my hand. Hey, Lieutenant, help me roll up my sleeve. But the person in front of me didn't move. I looked up and froze. It was Daniel. His outstretched hand hung stiffly in midair, his face dark with anger. You and him, you've become this close already? His words were absurd. I wasn't his wife anymore. Why was he here, acting as if I had betrayed him? He wasn't concerned about Joanna, yet he came looking for me just to throw a jealous fit. Worse, he even tried to make it sound like he was doing me a favor. You got what you wanted, he said coldly. You're a student at United University now. I even arranged for Joanna to attend a different school and had her move out of the Morgan estate. Are you satisfied? Can you finally come back now? I arched an eyebrow. Ah, so that explains why Miss Thompson has been making a scene in front of your house lately. Got tired of her free lodging, did she? Then I smirked. But what does that have to do with me? Mr. Morgan, what makes you think I'd give up my perfectly good dorm room just to go live in your second-hand estate? Daniel's face twisted in anger. You think that pilot will really marry you? He scoffed, thinking he had found my weakness. He's just playing with you. If he was serious, why hasn't he married you already? Why hasn't he moved you into the Air Force Village? A firm voice came from behind me, loud and clear. Because Emily Carter is meant to soar freely across the skies, not be caged in a tiny Air Force village. I turned to see Lucas standing there, his flight jacket riddled with bullet holes. But this time, pinned to his chest was a Medal of Honor. He stepped forward and handed me a document. A drafted report. At the bottom, in the section for beneficiary of pension benefits, he had written my name. If I die in service to my country, he said lightly, this money is yours to use however you wish. I looked at the two men standing in front of me. Daniel had always called me Mrs. Morgan, as if marriage to him had been a privilege I should be grateful for. He had believed that spending 40 years locked in a suffocating marriage was good fortune. Even on my deathbed in my past life, he had looked at me with disappointment, questioning what I had to be so unhappy about. But Lucas, he simply handed me a report, and to keep me from feeling pressured, he even explained casually, my family was lost to war. I have no one left. Might as well let the wind carry me as far as it will. If that day ever comes, just think of me as the tailwind pushing you forward, Miss Carter. I didn't want him to be my tailwind, The more I got to know him, the more I just wanted one thing: for him to come back, safe and whole, to live to see the day of victory. I couldn't remember how Lucas's story had ended in my past life. All I knew was that I had once read a newspaper article that in the final days of the war, West City had suffered relentless bombings, and many of its Air Force heroes had never returned. I didn't know if the wreckage among the ruins would one day include Lucas Foster, falling from the sky. I didn't know if among the debris there would be 617, the plane I had painstakingly repaired with my own hands. Just the thought of it made my heart clench with pain. I took a sip of whiskey, feigning drunkenness as I joked with Lucas. Find someone else to fix 617. I can't do it anymore. I couldn't bear the thought of that day coming. I couldn't imagine the crushing guilt, the endless regret. How would I even begin to identify his remains among the wreckage? Lucas didn't brush my words aside. He didn't take my joking tone as an excuse to ignore the weight of what I had said. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Emily, I didn't think it through." I nearly blurted out, "Then don't go. Don't be a pilot. Just stay with me and live an ordinary life." But I couldn't say it. Just like how he had never asked me to leave the repair shop, to give up my work and move into the Air Force village to wait for him. If he had never tried to take away my ambitions, how could I ask him to abandon his? I forced a smile. "I'm just joking. I'll wait for you to come back." I pulled him into a fierce hug, my tears soaking into the fabric of his uniform. "You have to come back." The war intensified. Enemy planes bombed West City so frequently that air raid sirens became part of daily life. The first alarm meant an enemy aircraft had been spotted. By the time the third alarm sounded, the bombing had already begun. That day, I had been helping my professor bury precious equipment underground to prevent it from being destroyed. By the time I rushed outside, the third alarm was already blaring. I had no time to run for higher ground. Suddenly, a strong arm yanked me into a nearby trench. "Don't be afraid. It's me. Daniel." He shielded me with his body, protecting me from the falling debris. When the bombing finally ceased and the ground stopped trembling, I pulled away from him. "Thank you." But as soon as I stood up, I saw Joanna standing nearby, covered in dust and rage burning in her eyes. "Daniel?" she shrieked. "I'm the one who's supposed to be your wife. Why are you protecting her?" That was when I finally learned they were engaged. Joanna had been so desperate to take my place that she had dropped out of school just to return to the Morgan estate and become his wife. Yet now, the once harmonious couple was constantly at odds. "I saved her before," Daniel said, his tone filled with frustration. "Back when my parents sent her to me, back when we fled south together, I saved her many times." He clenched his jaw. "When someone is in danger right in front of you, do you expect me to just stand by and watch?" The same situation, the same argument. Only this time, I was the one being protected, and Joanna was the one being accused of making a scene. I used to think that my marriage to Daniel had been so miserable because he had never loved me. I had foolishly believed that if Joanna had been the one by his side back then, they would have been a happy couple. But now I realized it would have ended the same way. Daniel turned to me, as if trying to reason with me. "Lucas can promise you the world, but when it truly matters, when you're in real danger, do you think he'll be able to protect you?" I tilted my head back, gazing at the sky. The smoke had cleared, revealing a rare moment of peace. "If it weren't for them fighting above us right now," I said evenly, "would either of us even be standing here?" When I climbed out of the trench, devastation stretched as far as the eye could see. The streets were in ruins, broken branches and shattered beams tangled together in heaps of debris. Some people rejoiced at surviving another bombing. Others wailed in agony over the loved ones they had lost. Far beyond the destruction, the sky glowed with streaks of rose-colored dusk. Joanna turned away and retched, unable to stomach the sight. I had no interest in staying any longer. Without a word, I made my way back to the aircraft repair factory. Lucas had promised me, if there was news, he would send word to the repair shop. If there was no news, it meant he was safe. I didn't remember how I got through that night. Every tiny sound startled me awake. I kept fearing that I would see a familiar face at my door, clutching a blood-stained flight jacket, the last remnant of Lucas Foster. Dawn broke before I was finally able to rest for a moment. And so the days passed. The bombings became less frequent. Then finally, I received a letter from Lucas. Emily, the tides are turning. Victory is within reach. I'll be returning next month. I never made any promises before, because I never knew if I'd survive to keep them. But now, with an end in sight, Emily Carter, will you marry me? I reached into the bottom of an old wooden chest and pulled out a piece of red brocade silk. This fabric was a gift from my mother. She had told me that one day, when I found the person I truly loved, I should use it to make a chipao for my wedding. I brought the fabric to a tailor and placed an order. The work would take 10 days, just in time for me to wear it when I welcomed Lucas home. That was my answer to him. Just as I was finalizing the design, Joanna stormed into the shop without a word. Before I could react, she grabbed a pair of scissors and slashed the fabric into 2 jagged halves. "It was you," she hissed. "You seduced Daniel. That's why he can't find a moment of peace." Her eyes were wild with fury. "I will never let him go. Even if I die, I will die as Mrs. Morgan." A ringing noise filled my ears. I clenched the torn fabric in my hands, frozen in place. Then, from outside the shop, I heard the voice of a pilot. "Excuse me, is Miss Carter here? We've come to deliver the deputy captain's personal belongings." 2 letters were placed in my hands. The first was a marriage proposal. The second, a death notice. Lucas's comrade explained everything. Victory was so close, but the enemy launched a final, desperate counterattack. The deputy captain fought bravely, but his plane was critically damaged. In the end, he took the enemy aircraft down with him, crashing into the river below. "His remains were never found. He didn't want you to feel guilty," the pilot added softly. "That's why he didn't leave behind any wreckage." I could only stare at them in silence. There was nothing left to say. They left behind his military compensation payment and departed. Daniel arrived shortly after, dragging Joanna with him. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said. "Tonight was a misunderstanding. I misjudged the situation between us. That fabric, where did you buy it? I'll find the exact same one and replace it for you." "Get out." I grabbed everything within reach and hurled it at them. "Get out." I slammed the door shut and collapsed to the floor. Tears fell silently, sinking into the dust. Why? Why? I had been so close. Just a little longer, and he would have returned to me. I fell gravely ill after that. Once I recovered, I took a leave of absence from school and bought a ticket to the place where Lucas's plane had gone down. On the day of my departure, Daniel took the seat next to mine on the train. He and Joanna had annulled their engagement. "For so long I was blind," he murmured. "I thought what I felt for Joanna was love, but it was nothing more than sibling affection. It was you. It was always you." He placed a box of pastries in front of me. "Emily, give me a chance. Let me take care of you." I said nothing. Instead, I tapped on the window. Joanna, who had been waiting outside, immediately rushed toward the train. I stood up and walked to the dining car. I didn't want to be entangled with them anymore, and I certainly no longer needed those cheap pastries. "Mr. Morgan," I said as I left, "I was never the person you needed to take care of, and I never will be." When the train arrived, I realized something. The river where Lucas had fallen was upstream from the very place where we had first met. The morning mist had lifted, and sunlight shone down upon the water. And there, standing by the shore, was a familiar face. The little girl I had saved that day. Back then, she had barely reached my knees. Now, she was nearly up to my chest. "After you left," she said excitedly, "some pilots helped me find my grandmother. And a kind big brother even bought me candy." She stood on her tiptoes and placed a piece of malt candy into my mouth. Then, noticing my tears, she gently wiped my face. "Sis, why are you crying?" I shook my head and pulled her into a tight embrace. Only then did I finally find the courage to open Lucas's last letter. "Emily, many of our fellow cadets have fallen, scattered across the land. I accepted my fate the moment I made my emergency landing in West City all those years ago. I never expected to survive long enough to meet you again. For the years that followed, I had only one selfish wish, to be lucky enough to see you one more time. Please accept the compensation payment. If my death can help pave the way for your future, then my parents can rest in peace." The waves lapped against the hem of my dress. In the distance, I could almost hear the echoes of a bright, sunlit day in West City. Lucas lowered his gaze to look at me. Then let me be the wind that carries you forward, Miss Carter. When I returned to West City, my professor handed me a letter of recommendation. It was my ticket to study abroad. I pursued a double major in mechanical engineering and aeronautics. When I finally returned home, I was assigned to classified projects in the Northwest. By the time I set foot in West City again, 20 years had passed. My professor told me that Daniel had come looking for me many times, this late asking for my address and contact information. He even secretly cut out my picture from the university's bulletin board and took it with him. Shameless. Back then, his messy divorce with Joanna had been the talk of the town. The two of them had spent their days in dance halls and movie theaters, burning through what was left of the Morgan family fortune. The Morgan estate had been mortgaged off. Joanna had run away with some smuggler from the southern provinces. But a few years later, she slinked back into town, stripped of her former radiance. Now, Daniel was in poor health, living permanently in a sanitarium. With nowhere else to go, Joanna clung to him once again, scheming to get her hands on his meager pension. Their endless fights could be heard from the neighboring wards, furniture crashing and voices shrieking in argument. My professor complained about the noise, but his eyes gleamed with curiosity. He pushed me out into the hallway, pretending it was just to fetch some hot water, while in reality, he wanted to watch the drama unfold. Standing in the corridor with a kettle in my hand, I couldn't help but laugh. I had seen this scene before. Only back then, I had been the one lying in that hospital bed, drowning in misery. One wrong step and every step after had been a mistake. But fate had given me a second chance. This time, I had chosen myself. And the man I loved had wanted me to be no one but myself. For the first time, my future stretched wide and unburdened before me. Inside the hospital room, Daniel was gripping his head, pained from yet another argument with Joanna. And then, through the open door, he caught sight of a familiar figure. A figure that had haunted his dreams for decades. He shoved Joanna aside and stumbled toward the hallway, bumping into chairs along the way. The woman turned. And there it was, the face he had burned into his memory. But in this lifetime, Daniel had never seen Emily Carter grow old. Yet for weeks now, he had been having dreams. In those dreams, Emily had never gone to university. She had married him instead. They had shared a life, even had a son. But in those dreams, he had never been satisfied. He had spent his days preoccupied with Joanna, neglecting Emily. And when Emily had fallen ill, he had spoken cruel words to her. In the dream, he had wanted to stop himself, to undo it all. But no matter how hard he tried, he was powerless to change anything. He would wake up in a cold sweat, telling himself it was just a dream. If Emily had truly married him back then, he would have treated her well. He would never have let things turn out that way. And yet now, as he stood face to face with her, she looked exactly as she had in his dreams. The only difference was, the Emily in his dreams had always been lifeless, her gaze dull and empty. But the woman standing before him now was radiant, the same face, but a completely different life. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "I must have mistaken you for someone else." Shame burned through him. He turned and fled before he could humiliate himself further.